Welcome back, y'all. Two heartwarming tales, the place where every story warms your heart and reminds you what real love and kindness look like. Before we get into today's story, go on and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. 'Cause today we're telling you about a cowboy who loved a woman his whole life in silence and quietly saved her from ruin without ever asking for a single thing in return. Back in the summer of 1885, in a quiet little town called Cedar Hollow, Texas, there lived a young cowhand named Wade Coleman. Wade wasn't much to look at on paper, no fancy last name, no land to his name, just a strong back, calloused hands, and a horse he loved near as much as life itself. He worked the Hayes family ranch, one of the biggest spreads in the county, breaking horses and mending fences for wages barely enough to keep him fed and clothed. It was on that very ranch where Wade first fell for Eleanor Hayes, the only daughter of old Harlan Hayes, the wealthiest rancher in Cedar Hollow. Eleanor was something special, sharp-witted, kind-hearted, with a laugh that carried clean across the pasture, and a spirit that refused to be boxed in by the fancy manners her mother tried so hard to instill in her. She'd sneak out to the barn most evenings, just to talk with Wade while he worked, the two of them swapping stories and dreams beneath the wide Texas sky. By the time Wade turned 20 and Eleanor 18, what had started as innocent friendship had blossomed into something neither of them could deny any longer. Stolen glances turned into stolen moments. Quiet walks along the creek at dusk, whispered conversations hidden behind the old barn, a single, tender kiss shared beneath the branches of an ancient oak tree that still stands on that property to this very day. Wade Coleman, Eleanor had told him one evening, her fingers laced through his as they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant orange and pink. "I don't care one lick what my daddy thinks about your station in life. I love you, plain and simple." Wade had held her hand tight, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show, telling her he loved her too, though he warned her gently that her family had plans for her that didn't include a fella like him. Eleanor, for all her fire and determination, underestimated just how deeply her family's pride ran. When Harlan Hayes discovered his daughter's feelings for a lowly ranch hand, his fury was something fierce to behold. He forbade her from ever speaking to Wade again, and within weeks, he'd fired Wade from the ranch entirely, making certain word spread through the county that no other rancher ought to hire him either, effectively running the young cowboy clean out of Cedar Hollow. Worse still, Harlan had already begun arrangements for Eleanor to marry Marcus Whitmore, a wealthy businessman from Dallas who'd taken a keen interest in both Eleanor's beauty and, perhaps more significantly, the substantial Hayes ranch land she stood to inherit. Eleanor fought against the arrangement with everything she had, pleading with her father Creon herself to sleep countless nights, even attempting to run off and find Wade before the wedding could take place. But her father, desperate and unyielding, kept her confined to the family estate until her spirit, worn down by weeks of isolation and pressure, finally began to break. Wade, meanwhile, had been forced to leave Cedar Hollow entirely, drifting from ranch to ranch across Texas, his heart heavy with grief and helplessness. Eventually, word reached him, secondhand through an old friend, that Eleanor's wedding to Marcus Whitmore had been set for the following spring. Devastated beyond words, Wade made the painful decision to stay away entirely, believing, wrongly, though understandably, that his continued presence would only bring Eleanor further hardship and heartbreak. Eleanor married Marcus Whitmore that following spring in a lavish ceremony attended by half the county, her father beaming with pride at securing his daughter's future, entirely unaware of the quiet devastation hidden behind his daughter's carefully composed smile. As she said her vows that day, Eleanor's mind drifted, despite her best efforts, to a humble cowboy and a single stolen kiss beneath an old oak tree, a memory she tucked away deep in her heart, never imagining just how many painful years would pass before fate would bring Wade Coleman back into her life once again. The first year of Eleanor's marriage passed in a haze of forced smiles and quiet disappointment. Marcus, it turned out, was far more interested in the prestige and wealth attached to the Hayes name than he ever was in Eleanor herself. He'd married her, in truth, as much for the substantial ranch land she stood to inherit as for any genuine affection, though he'd hidden this reality skillfully enough during their brief courtship to fool both Eleanor and her trusting father. Once old Harlan Hayes passed away, unexpectedly from a sudden illness, Marcus's true colors began revealing themselves with increasing clarity. Eleanor, now sole heir to the substantial Hayes ranch, found herself increasingly isolated within her own marriage. Marcus began making business decisions regarding the property without so much as consulting her, slowly consolidating control over assets that were rightfully hers by inheritance. When Eleanor dared to question his decisions, his responses grew sharper, colder, occasionally crossing into outright cruelty. The verbal cruelty, over time, escalated into something far more frightening. Marcus, frustrated by Eleanor's continued resistance to signing over a full legal control of the ranch, began using increasingly aggressive tactics to break her spirit, isolating her from what few friends she had left in Cedar Hollow, controlling her access to money entirely, and on more than one occasion, laying hands on her in fits of rage when she refused to comply with his demands. Eleanor, trapped in a marriage that had become a prison of fear and control, found herself with nowhere to turn. Her father was gone. Her mother had passed years earlier, and Marcus had systematically cut her off from any remaining family, friends, or allies who might have offered assistance. She endured in silence, the vibrant, fiery young woman who'd once dreamed of a life with Wade, Coleman slowly fading beneath the weight of fear, isolation, and grief. After nearly 5 years of this deteriorating marriage, Marcus finally achieved what he'd been working toward from the very beginning, through a combination of legal manipulation, forged signatures, and Eleanor's own broken spirit. He secured full legal ownership of the entire Hayes Ranch, stripping Eleanor of any legal claim to the property her family had built over generations. With the land finally secured under his name, Marcus wasted little time discarding Eleanor entirely, filing for divorce swiftly and coldly, offering her almost nothing beyond a small, run-down cottage on the outskirts of the property. The devastation of losing her family's legacy, combined with years of psychological and physical abuse, took a catastrophic toll on Eleanor's health. Shortly after the divorce was finalized, she began experiencing a gradual, terrifying loss of vision, worsening steadily over several months, until eventually she found herself completely blind. Doctors who examined her found no physical cause whatsoever, concluding instead that the trauma and grief she'd endured had manifested itself physically, a condition brought on entirely by the overwhelming psychological weight of everything she'd suffered. Eleanor, now blind, alone, and stripped of nearly everything her family had built, found herself living in quiet isolation in the small, deteriorating cottage, dependent entirely on the charity of a single elderly housekeeper, Martha, who'd remained loyal to the Hayes family long after everyone else had abandoned them. The once thriving ranch surrounding her small home fell further into disrepair with each passing season. Word of Eleanor's tragic circumstances slowly spread through Cedar Hollow and beyond, whispered about in hushed, pitying tones by townsfolk who remembered the vibrant young woman she'd once been. It was through one such conversation, overheard entirely by chance in a saloon nearly 300 miles away, that Wade Coleman, now a weathered, experienced cowboy in his own right, first learned of Eleanor's devastating fall from prosperity into blindness, poverty, and isolation. The news struck him like a physical blow, and within days, he had packed his few belongings, saddled his horse, and set out on the long journey back toward Cedar Hollow. The ride back to Cedar Hollow took Wade the better part of 2 weeks, giving him plenty of time to turn over in his mind exactly what he might say, or do, upon finding Eleanor after all these years. He wasn't fool enough to believe she'd welcome him with open arms. Not after all this time. Not after everything she'd endured. When he finally arrived, the town looked much the same as he remembered, though weathered slightly by the passage of years, and his chest tightened at the sight of the once grand Hayes Ranch, now overgrown and abandoned to the elements. He found the small cottage where Eleanor now resided, tucked away near the edge of the property, modest and worn, smoke curling faintly from its chimney, the only sign of life within. Before he could summon the courage to knock, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman who eyed him with cautious suspicion, asking if she could help him. Wade removed his hat respectfully and explained he'd heard about Miss Eleanor's circumstances and was hoping he might be of some help. The woman, Martha, studied him carefully before her expression softened with recognition, repeating his name softly and explaining that Eleanor had mentioned it before, years back, though rarely. She hesitated before telling him that Eleanor was blind now, had been for some time, and that it had been difficult watching her lose everything she once had. Wade's chest tightened painfully at the confirmation of what he'd only heard secondhand. Wade told Martha he'd like to help however he was able, and that Eleanor didn't need to know it was him, if that would make things easier. He said he couldn't right away, knowing she was struggling this bad without doing something about it. Martha studied him a moment longer, weighing his sincerity, before finally nodding slowly, explaining that the ranch had fallen into terrible disrepair and that any help at all would be desperately needed, though she warned him Eleanor was proud, even now, and wouldn't take charity either. Then she won't know it's charity, Wade said firmly. I'll tell her I'm just a drifter passing through, willing to work the land in exchange for a place to bunk and a meal now and then. She don't ever have to know who I really am, not unless she wants to. Martha considered this proposition carefully before finally agreeing, recognizing both the genuine sincerity in Wade's offer and the desperate necessity of any help at all for Eleanor's continued survival. That evening, Wade was cautiously introduced to Eleanor for the first time in over 6 years, simply as a traveling ranch hand named Cole, sitting quietly in a modest chair near the small fireplace, her once vibrant eyes now clouded and unseeing. Eleanor appeared far more fragile than the fiery young woman Wade remembered. Yet even now, even blind and broken by years of hardship, there remained an unmistakable strength and dignity in the way she carried herself. Eleanor thanked him politely for his willingness to help around the ranch, unaware entirely that the man offering assistance was the very same cowboy her family had once driven away. Wade replied carefully, disguising his voice slightly, his heart aching at being so close to her again after all these years, yet unable to reveal his true identity, knowing that, for now, the kindest thing he could do was simply begin the quiet work of rebuilding what her family and her marriage had torn apart. Over the following weeks, Wade threw himself entirely into restoring the neglected Hayes Ranch, working from sunrise to well past sunset, determined to bring life back to the land Eleanor's family had once been so proud of. He repaired fences, plank by plank, cleared overgrown fields, repaired the barn's collapsing roof, and slowly began reintroducing livestock, using what little savings he'd accumulated over his years, drifting from ranch to ranch. Eleanor, unable to see the physical transformation taking place around her, nonetheless began noticing subtle changes in her daily life. The constant worry over how she and Martha would manage financially began easing slightly as fresh vegetables, eggs, and eventually milk from a small herd of dairy cows Wade had acquired began appearing regularly at their table. She could hear, even if she couldn't see, the distant sounds of hammering, sewing, and cattle loven contentedly in freshly repaired pastures. Mr. Cole seems quite skilled, Eleanor remarked one evening to Martha, as the three of them shared a simple supper together, remarking that the ranch sounded alive again in a way it hadn't in years. Martha, carefully guarding Wade's true identity, as promised, simply nodded in agreement, saying he was a hard worker and that the ranch was coming back together nicely under his care. Eleanor, though blind, found herself increasingly curious about this quiet, humble stranger who'd shown up so unexpectedly, a skin for nothing more than simple room and board in exchange for his labor. There was something oddly familiar about his voice, his mannerisms, though she couldn't quite place why, attributing the sensation simply to the comfort of having someone reliable around after years of isolation and hardship. Wade, for his part, found the deception increasingly difficult to maintain the longer he remained, being so close to Eleanor again, hearing her voice daily, witnessing firsthand the quiet strength and resilience she continued to display despite her blindness and everything she'd endured, reignited feelings he'd spent years trying desperately to suppress. He took every precaution to avoid direct, prolonged interaction with her, mindful of accidentally revealing his true identity through some careless slip of familiarity. One afternoon, Eleanor ventured cautiously out into the yard, using a cane to navigate the familiar paths she'd memorized over years of living on the property. Wade, working nearby, immediately noticed her struggling against a sudden, unexpected gust of wind that knocked her slightly off balance, and without thinking, he rushed forward, gently steadying her before she could stumble further. "Careful there, ma'am," he said softly, his voice momentarily slipping from its practiced disguise into something warmer, more familiar. Eleanor froze for a brief moment, something about the gentle, protective way he'd caught her striking an unexpected chord of memory deep within her, though she thanked him simply and let the strange sensation pass, unaware of just how close she'd come to recognizing the truth. As months passed, Such small, quiet moments of genuine connection continued to accumulate in between them. Despite Wade's best efforts to maintain careful emotional distance, Elena found herself increasingly drawn to this humble, hard-working stranger, appreciating deeply his gentle patience, his quiet strength, and the profound sense of safety and stability he'd brought back into her fractured life. Entirely unaware that the man she was slowly, cautiously beginning to trust and admire once again was the very same cowboy whose heart she'd broken so many years before. As the seasons turned, the Hayes Ranch continued its remarkable transformation under Wade's tireless care. What had once been a symbol of tragic decline slowly blossomed back into a thriving, productive property, gaining notice and quiet admiration throughout Cedar Hollow. Neighbors who passed by occasionally remarked on the impressive turnaround, curious about the mysterious, humble ranch hand responsible for such dramatic improvements, though Wade carefully avoided drawing attention to himself whenever possible. Eleanor's own spirits, too, began slowly reviving alongside the ranch itself. Though her blindness remained unchanged, the constant anxiety and desperation that had defined her daily existence for years began easing considerably, replaced gradually by a cautious, tentative sense of security and hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She found herself looking forward to simple, everyday interactions with Mr. Cole, his quiet, steady presence during meals, his gentle patience whenever he assisted her around the property, the surprising depth of kindness and understanding he displayed despite his rough, humble exterior. There was something deeply comforting about his presence, something that stirred emotions within her she'd long since believed permanently buried beneath years of heartbreak and betrayal. One particular evening, as autumn winds began signaling the approach of another Texas winter, Eleanor sat alone on the porch, listening quietly to the familiar sounds of Wade finishing his evening chores nearby. Unable to resist her curiosity any longer, she called out softly, asking if she might trouble him for a moment of conversation. Eleanor told him she found herself curious about him, that he'd been nothing but kind and generous since arriving, asking for so little in return, and that such selfless kindness was unusual in her experience. Wade shifted uncomfortably, telling her he was just trying to do right by folks, and that there weren't nothing particularly special about it. "Perhaps not to you," Eleanor replied softly, "but to me, after everything I've endured, it means more than you likely realize." She told him, hesitantly, about her marriage, about a man who'd cared far more for wealth and status than he ever had for her, and about someone else, long before that marriage, a young man she'd cared for deeply, though circumstances and family pride had kept them apart. Wade sat frozen, his heart pounding fiercely, torn between the overwhelming urge to finally reveal his true identity and the fear of how such a revelation might affect Eleanor, especially given her current vulnerable state. He told her carefully that if this fella truly loved her, he'd have understood that sometimes circumstances beyond our control keep good people apart through no fault of their own. Eleanor nodded slowly, comforted somehow by his gentle words, though entirely unaware of just how deeply personal his understanding truly was. As Wade quietly excused himself shortly afterward, retreating to the solitude of the barn, he found himself wrestling more intensely than ever with the painful secret he continued to carry, increasingly uncertain how much longer he could bear keep his true identity hidden from the woman he'd never truly stopped loving. Winter settled over Cedar Hollow, bringing with it cold winds and frosty mornings, though the warmth steadily growing between Eleanor and the man she knew only as Cole seemed entirely unaffected by the season's chill. Their conversations, once cautious and formal, gradually deepened into something far more comfortable, far more intimate, as months of quiet companionship slowly rebuilt trust and connection between them. Eleanor found herself sharing more openly than she had in years, telling Wade stories of her childhood on the ranch, her complicated relationship with her late father, and though carefully avoiding specific names, fragments of the young love she'd once known and lost due to her family's rigid expectations. Wade listened intently to every word, his heart aching with bittersweet nostalgia, torn between profound joy at reconnecting so deeply with Eleanor and painful guilt over the continued deception surrounding his true identity. It was during one particularly cold evening, as Wade helped guide Eleanor carefully back toward the house after she'd insisted on accompanying him to check on the horses, that suspicion first began quietly stirring within her. as his hand steadied hers against a sudden, icy patch on the path. Something about the familiar warmth and gentleness of his touch struck her powerfully. "Mr. Cole," she said slowly, her voice tinged with genuine curiosity. "Might I ask you something rather personal? Have we perhaps met before, long before you arrived here as a traveling ranch hand? There's something about you, your voice, your mannerisms, even the way you've just now steadied my hand that feels remarkably familiar, though I cannot quite place why." Wade's heart pounded fiercely, caught entirely off guard by her sudden, perceptive question. He hesitated, torn between finally revealing the truth and continuing the careful deception he'd maintained for months now, telling her only that folks sometimes remind us of others we've known, and that perhaps that was all it was. Eleanor nodded slowly, though clearly unconvinced entirely by his careful deflection, allowing the matter to rest, at least for the time being. That night, alone in the barn, Wade wrestled fiercely with his conscience, recognizing clearly that Eleanor's suspicions, however vague, were steadily growing stronger, and that he could not continue this deception indefinitely without risking far greater harm to the fragile trust they'd carefully rebuilt. Martha, observing the growing tension and unspoken emotion between the two, finally approached Wade privately one morning, telling him gently but firmly, using his true name deliberately, that she'd watched them grow closer these past months, watched Eleanor slowly coming back to life again after years of despair, but that this secret couldn't continue forever, and that Eleanor deserved the truth, however difficult it may be to share. Wade nodded slowly, recognizing the undeniable truth in Martha's gentle words, admitting softly that he was terrified of Lucy and Eleanor again, especially now that he'd only just found his way back into her life. Martha placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, telling him that sometimes the very love we're afraid of losing is exactly what gives us the courage to finally speak the truth, and that Eleanor was stronger than he realized. Spring arrived gently in Cedar Hollow, bringing new life and color back to the once neglected Hayes Ranch, now fully restored to its former prosperity under Wade's dedicated care. Eleanor, too, seemed to be blossoming alongside the land itself, her spirit steadily healing, her laughter returning more frequently, especially during her gentle, comfortable conversations with Mr. Cole. Encouraged by Martha's wise counsel, Wade finally resolved to reveal his true identity to Eleanor, choosing a quiet, peaceful evening as new spring flowers bloomed fragrantly around the porch where they often sat together. He began carefully, telling her there was something important he needed to tell her, something he probably should have told her months ago. Eleanor turned her sightless eyes toward him, sensing immediately the seriousness in his tone, and asked what it was, worry creeping into her voice. Wade took a deep, steadying breath, prepared finally to reveal the truth he'd carried silently for so long. But before he could speak the words, a sudden, urgent commotion erupted from the direction of the barn. Panicked shouting from one of the ranch hands, warning of a fire that had unexpectedly broken out among the hay stores. Wade leapt immediately into action, rushing toward the barn to help contain the danger, the urgent crisis forcing his intended confession to wait. For the next several hours, Wade and the other hands worked frantically, battling the flames and ultimately saving both the barn and the surrounding property from serious damage, though exhaustion and smoke left him in no condition to continue the delicate conversation he'd intended earlier that evening. In the chaotic aftermath of the fire, the opportunity for confession slipped quietly away, overshadowed by the practical necessities of assessing damage, and reassuring a frightened, worried Eleanor that everyone remained safe. Wade, exhausted and emotionally drained, found himself once again hesitating, uncertain when, or if, another suitable opportunity might present itself. Eleanor Manuel remained increasingly troubled by Wade's earlier hesitation, her earlier suspicions regarding his true identity growing stronger with each passing day. She began paying closer attention to small details she'd previously overlooked, Tekayus on his hands that matched precisely the way she remembered from years past, the particular rhythm of his footsteps, even certain phrases and expressions he used that stirred distant, achingly familiar memories. One quiet afternoon, while Wade was occupied elsewhere on the property, Eleanor cautiously approached Martha, her voice trembling slightly, asking her to be honest, asking whether Mr. Cole was truly who he claimed to be. Martha hesitated, torn between her promise to protect Wade's secret and her deep affection for Eleanor, unable to bear watching her continue suffering under uncertainty any longer. And finally, told her gently that it was time she heard the truth directly from him, though whatever, or whoever, she suspected him to be. His intentions these past months had come from nothing but genuine, selfless love. Eleanor's breath caught sharply at Martha's careful words, her heart pounding with overwhelming realization and anticipation. She understood, with sudden, powerful clarity, precisely what Mr. Cole truly was, and the profound weight of everything he'd quietly sacrificed over months of selfless devotion to help restore both her ranch and her shattered spirit, without ever once a skin for recognition, gratitude, or reward. That evening, as Wade returned from his daily chores, exhausted but unaware of the profound realization Eleanor had reached earlier that afternoon, he found her waiting quietly for him on the porch, her expression a complex mixture of vulnerability, hope, and quiet determination. "Wade," she said softly, deliberately using his true name for the very first time, and Wade froze mid, his heart lurching painfully at the sound of his true name spoken so gently, so knowingly, from Eleanor's lips. "You don't need to explain," Eleanor interrupted softly, her sightless eyes glistening with unshed tears, before Wade could even begin. "Martha told me enough. I understand now, Wade. Everything you've quietly done for me these past months, restoring the ranch. Karin, for me. Protecting my dignity. All without ever asking for anything in return." Wade remained silent, uncertain how to respond, his emotions overwhelmed by relief, guilt, and profound love all colliding together at once. Eleanor continued, her voice trembling with emotion long suppressed, telling him she'd carried guilt for years over how things had ended between them, over her own weakness in allowing her family's pride to come between their happiness, and that now, after everything he'd shown her, she found herself ashamed that it had taken her this long to recognize the depth of his love, and her own foolishness in ever letting him go. "Eleanor," Wade said softly, moving closer, gently tucking her hands into his own. "You've nothing to be ashamed of. Circumstances kept us apart, not any true failing on your part. I never stopped loving you, not once, not for a single day, even during all those years apart." Tears slipped silently down Eleanor's cheeks, her fingers tightening gently around his. Despite Wade's heartfelt reassurances, Eleanor remained hesitant, her own insecurities regarding her blindness continuing to hold her back from fully embracing the love she now recognized so clearly. She feared becoming a burden, feared that Wade's affection might one day fade beneath the weight of her physical limitations, despite his sincere and repeated assurances otherwise. And she asked him softly to give her time, telling him she needed to fully believe she deserved this happiness. After everything that had happened, Wade nodded gently, respecting her request despite his own aching desire to fully embrace the love they'd both clearly rediscovered, telling her softly that he wasn't going anywhere, that he'd waited this long and could wait a while longer still. Months passed, peacefully following Eleanor's emotional confession, while they continued faithfully by her side, patiently respecting her need for time and healing, never once wavering in his quiet devotion despite the uncertainty surrounding their future together. Their bond deepened steadily, evolving naturally from careful friendship into something openly affectionate. Though Eleanor still hesitated fully embracing a future together, her insecurities regarding her blindness continuing to linger. Then, one fateful summer eve, nearly a year after Wade's initial return to Cedar Hollow, a sudden, violent thunderstorm swept through the region, bringing with it dangerous lightning and torrential rains reminiscent, in some strange way, of the very storm that had once brought Wade back into Eleanor's life. As the storm intensified, a sudden, powerful bolt of lightning struck perilously close to the ranch house, the accompanying explosive crash of thunder startling Eleanor so profoundly that she stumbled backward in shock, striking her head sharply against the porch railing before collapsing unconscious to the ground. Wade rushed in immediately to her side, carried her gently inside, desperately calling for Martha to fetch the town doctor as quickly as possible despite the raging storm outside. Eleanor remained unconscious for several agonizing hours, Wade keeping constant vigil by her bedside, praying fervently for her safe recovery. When Eleanor finally began staring awake late that night, Wade leaned anxiously closer, his heart pounding with worry and hope intertwined, whispering softly to ask if she could hear him. Eleanor blinked slowly, disoriented at first, before her eyes widened suddenly with astonishment and disbelief, whispering his name and telling him she could see him, that she could actually see him. The doctor, arriving shortly afterward, examined Eleanor carefully, astonished himself at this unexpected, remarkable recovery, explaining his best medical understanding of the time allowed that the sudden physical shock from her fall may have somehow triggered a reversal of the psychological trauma initially responsible for her blindness. An extraordinary, though not entirely unprecedented, medical phenomenon. Eleanor, overwhelmed with emotion at finally seeing clearly again after years of darkness, gazed tearfully upon Wade's face for the first time in over 6 years, finding him older, weathered by hardship and hard work, yet unmistakably still the same kind, gentle soul she'd fallen in love with so many years before, whispering that it truly was him, all this time, Karine, for her, protecting her, loving her so selflessly, even after everything. News of Eleanor's miraculous recovery spread quickly through Cedar Hollow, astonishing and delighting the entire community, many of whom had watched with quiet sympathy over the years. As Eleanor's life had unraveled so tragically, yet nothing delighted the townsfolk more than learning shortly afterward of the deep, enduring love story that had quietly unfolded between Eleanor and the humble cowboy who'd secretly restored both her ranch and her spirit. Wade and Eleanor wasted little time formalizing their renewed commitment to one another, choosing to marry in a simple, heartfelt ceremony held beneath the very same ancient oak tree where they'd first confessed their love as young sweethearts so many years before. The entire town gathered joyfully to witness the union, celebrating not only the couple's reunion, but the profound, inspiring journey of resilience, redemption, and selfless love that had brought them back together after years of heartbreak and hardship. Eleanor, radiant and genuinely happy for the first time in years, stood proudly beside Wade as they exchanged heartfelt vows, promising unwavering love, loyalty, and partnership for the remainder of their lives together. Martha, who had faithfully stood by Eleanor throughout her darkest years, wept tears of pure joy, witnessing firsthand the beautiful culmination of patience, kindness, and enduring love. Following their wedding, Wade and Eleanor worked together, side by side, continuing to build upon the remarkable restoration of the Hayes Ranch, transforming it once again into a thriving, prosperous property, admired and respected throughout the county. Eleanor, her sight fully restored, took an active role in managing the ranch alongside Wade, her natural intelligence, determination, and resilience shining brightly. Once more, after years of quiet suffering, their love story became something of local legend throughout Cedar Hollow and beyond, often retold by townsfolk and travelers alike as a powerful testament to the enduring strength of true love, patience, and selfless kindness. Folks spoke admiringly of Wade's quiet humility, his willingness to sacrifice years of his own life, expecting nothing in return, simply to help heal the woman he'd never stopped loving, despite years of painful separation and heartbreak. Eleanor herself often reflected, in later years, on the painful lessons learned from her past, the danger of allowing pride and fear to dictate matters of the heart, the profound cost of prioritizing wealth and social status over genuine love and connection. She made certain, throughout her life, to instill these hard-won lessons in her own children, later born to her and Wade, teaching them always to value kindness, humility, and genuine love above wealth, status, or fleeting societal expectations. Wade, for his part, never once regretted the sacrifices he'd made throughout those quiet, humble years of selfless devotion, often remarking, with characteristic modesty, that true love required no reward beyond the simple, profound joy of seeing someone you cared for deeply find happiness, healing, and peace once again. As the years passed, Wade and Eleanor Coleman's story remained a cherished symbol throughout Cedar Hollow of the powerful, transformative nature of genuine kindness and selfless love. Proof that even after profound heartbreak, betrayal, and hardship, true love, patience, and quiet devotion could ultimately triumph, healing wounds once believed beyond repair and restoring happiness once thought lost forever. That's today's story, y'all. If this tale of patience, sacrifice, and enduring love touched your heart. Don't forget to hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs a reminder that true love never truly gives up. We'll see you in the next heartwarming tale. Welcome back, y'all. Two heartwarming tales, the place where every story warms your heart and reminds you what real love and kindness look like. Before we get into today's story, go on and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. 'Cause today we're telling you about a cowboy who loved a woman his whole life in silence and quietly saved her from ruin without ever asking for a single thing in return.